Hey folks, welcome into the News 12 Now Desk. Thanks for joining us here just after 11 o'clock on our Tuesday, May the 23rd. We're taking a look here kind of at the presidential landscape as a whole after Senator Tim Scott announced he was going to be throwing his hat in the ring, officially launching his bid to take the White House. Before we get into this though, real quick, do want to mention the YouTube channel that you guys should definitely subscribe to right here. Look at that, we're live right now. So if you go to this WRDW News 12 on YouTube and subscribe there, we stream every day on there. So if you want to check out our morning headlines, we have press conferences, breaking news. Just in the last hour, we had some House Democrats and House Republicans held separate press conferences talking about the debt limit and that deadline that is looming overhead. So we streamed those. So a lot of stuff goes on up on the YouTube channel, as well as stories, first alert weather forecast, back and forth that we do here on the News 12 Now Desk, interviews, we bring reporters up, all sorts of stuff. So it is a great resource. We're trying to stay up to date in the community. But let's get into this now. So the 2024 presidential election officially has a new competitor, Tim Scott, putting his name out there for the presidential bid. He joins a growing list of Republican candidates. We have Donald Trump, we have Nikki Haley, we have Asa Hutchinson, we have I know I'm missing at least one or two more, but it's starting to grow now. We're starting to see some more names pile in, and that hasn't counted Ron DeSantis, who's expected to join the race a little bit later on in the week, Mike Pence, whose name has still been floating around there. So there are still some more possible names who could join, but Tim Scott has officially joined after months of mulling it over. He says he is kicking off his campaign in his hometown of North Charleston at his alma mater of Charleston Southern. Our State House reporter Mary Green was there.
Just over a month ago, Senator Tim Scott launched an exploratory committee, signaling he was ready to join this growing Republican field. On Monday, Scott made it official, kicking off his 2024 campaign here at his alma mater, Charleston Southern.
Let's go!
A packed gymnasium crowd fired up by Senator Tim Scott's big announcement Monday.
That I'm running for president of the United States of America!
Scott pitched himself as the leader who can bring the country back from what he characterized as a retreating nation under President Joe Biden.
Retreating from our heritage and our history, retreating from personal responsibility and hard work, retreating from strength and security, even retreating from religious liberty and the worship of God himself.
He leaned heavily into his own biography, raised by a single working mom and rising from a once failing student to U.S. Senator, as he painted an overall optimistic outlook on the country's potential.
I'm living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not a land of oppression.
His name is the latest on a growing list of Republicans vying for the nomination, including former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley and former President Donald Trump, with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis reportedly launching his bid this week as well. Scott didn't mention his conservative competition, but told the North Charleston crowd that he is, quote, the candidate the far left most fears.
When I cut your taxes, they called me a prop. When I refunded the police, they called me a token. When I pushed back on President Biden, they even called me the N-word. I disrupt their narrative. I threaten their control. The truth of my life disrupts their lives.
So that was Mary Green there in Charleston, taking a look at some reaction to Senator Scott announcing he is running. This is Jamie Harrison, chair of the Democratic Committee. He said, there's no question that special interests are celebrating as Tim Scott throws his hat into the 2024 race for the MAGA base. Former President Trump actually had some well wishes for Senator Scott. He said, good luck to Senator Tim Scott in entering the Republican presidential primary race. It is rapidly loading up with lots of people, and Tim is a big step up from Ron DeSanctimonious, who is totally unelectable. So Donald Trump, much kinder words for Tim Scott than he had for Ron DeSantis, who's expected to be his biggest political opponent in this GOP race, even though polls right now are showing Donald Trump is way ahead of Ron DeSantis. And that actually brings us to our next story. This is taking a look here at the political outlook as a whole for this Republican nomination. The Democratic side does have a couple challengers in there, but Joe Biden appears to be a solid front runner on the Democrat side. So let's take a look at the Republican side. Christian Benavidez reports on the GOP race from Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida.
I'm running for President of the United States of America!
South Carolina's Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate, struck an optimistic tone as he kicked off his presidential campaign.
I'm living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not a land of oppression.
Scott, a conservative who grew up in poverty, is positioning himself as a positive alternative to today's divisive politics. Already in his corner, the Senate's number 2 Republican, South Dakota's John Thune.
Tim Scott is the real deal.
Also expected to join the race this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has been touting himself as the only Republican who can win a general election.
I think in Florida we really showed what it takes to not just win big, and then deliver big.
But polls show former President Donald Trump remains the clear frontrunner for the Republican nomination among likely GOP primary voters. In a recent CBS News poll, those voters said they are looking for a candidate who digs into the culture wars and makes liberals angry. That same poll shows Scott with just 1% support compared to 58% for Trump and 22% for DeSantis. Echoing those polls, most House Republicans from Florida have already endorsed Trump over DeSantis. Christian Benavidez, CBS News, Palm Beach, Florida.
Other candidates are officially running for the GOP nomination. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, like we said, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, and businessman Vivek Ramaswamy. And don't forget, former Vice President Mike Pence is still expected to join the race as well. So we are definitely not seeing the end of the GOP nominations. So 2 political allies, Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, now become rivals in this race for the GOP nomination. Former Governor Nikki Haley, she appointed Tim Scott as a state senator, or as a senator, I should say. Or Nick Veland has a closer look at South Carolina's role in this political sphere.
Yeah, that's right, Richard. So far, South Carolina keeps popping up in national headlines early on in this election cycle. On top of Haley and Scott's Palmetto State ties, South Carolina is also the first state where Democrats will cast their ballot in the primary. University of South Carolina professor Robert Olden-Dick says that this race could take a turn this year.
It's going to be different than past elections. It's going to be more difficult to predict, and there's going to be the possibility of something very unusual happening given the current front-running candidates.
Andrew Siders, vice chair of the Aiken County Council and the Aiken Republican Party, sees the uniqueness of having 2 candidates from the state already.
It's kind of interesting that we have 2 declared candidates for president coming from our state. It's not very typical coming from a state, but that seems to be where we're at, and it's going to be a very interesting ride.
Being first in the Democratic Party shakes things up for South Carolina. Democrats in Aiken say that they believe Biden is the frontrunner for their party, but still see the importance of the Palmetto State voters getting the first chance to vote.
And I think it's great that South Carolina is now the first in the nation, because the South Carolina Democratic Party electorate is much more representative of the Democratic Party as a whole than Iowa or New Hampshire have ever been.
And we're still a long ways from 2024, and both parties agree that the biggest goal right now is getting people ready to hit the polls.
Like Nick said right there, long way to go, but let's kind of talk about this a little bit more. I had talked with Dr. Greg Murray over at Augusta University a couple weeks ago before Tim Scott had thrown his hat in the ring. He had just launched that exploratory committee. We only had a few candidates in. I think Nikki Haley had just jumped into the race. And so we caught up with him and just kind of wanted to gauge what we were looking at, what the big talking points were coming into 2024. He's a political science professor at Augusta University, so has a lot of knowledge in this area. And one thing he talked about with Tim Scott, and you heard it a little bit in that Christian Benavidez piece, he's kind of an alternate to the big brash presidential candidates we've seen tossed around in the last couple months. Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis kind of being the big two. Those guys are going to battle. They've already taken some shots at one another. And Tim Scott is a little bit more of a neutral emotion kind of guy. And so he provides a different perspective on things. And we think back to 2016, and Donald Trump was so different than anything we'd ever seen. And so people were drawn to that. And so if people want something different from Donald Trump, maybe Tim Scott provides that little bit that they are looking for. So that was one of the things we had talked about. Another was just the bloodbath that we're going to see here in the next year or so between specifically Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And the question got asked, is it worth it for DeSantis to maybe sit this one out? Trump's kind of at the end of his political career. He's almost 80 years old, or his mid-70s. I don't know how old he is, actually. I'll look it up real quick. 76. So he'll be 77 here in a couple weeks. So he'll be 78 by the time this election rolls around. He would be 82 if he were to regain the White House and the 2028 election came around. So, he's towards the end of his political career. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis is only 44. So 30 years Trump's junior, a much longer career ahead. So the question gets brought up. Should DeSantis just sit this one out and kind of regroup himself for 2028 and then go for it then? But the iron is still hot, and it's important to strike while the iron's hot, because in politics, a lot of it is timing. Ron DeSantis really started to make a name for himself in the last 4 years when he was one of the first governors to ease COVID restrictions and to open things back up and kind of speak out against what he calls the woke ideologies. And COVID was a big opportunity for him to do that. So he built a lot of momentum that way. And so taking 4 years off and regrouping for 2028 may kill all of that momentum that he's built up in the last couple of years and really limit his chances at making a serious run at the White House. So that was something that we had talked about. Another thing was what's the big issues? What are the big issues coming in to 2024? And one of them is the economy. The economy is not where anybody really wants it to be right now. We've got a debt limit deadline coming up here in a week and a half now. That if we don't get there, we could see a recession, and that's going to be something working against Joe Biden right now. And that was something that Dr. Murray had talked about too. The role is kind of reversed when you're the incumbent versus when you're the new guy coming in. So one thing Biden was able to do in 2020 was attack what Trump had done over the last 4 years. But now everybody's turning the spears and pointing them at Biden, sitting in the White House saying, look what you did with this, look what you did with that. Over the last 4 years, I would do it better. So it kind of shifts the advantage, if you will, a little bit to the challengers, whereas Biden has to rely more on that record, which is something that they're going to go ahead and attack. So that kind of opens the door for maybe a little bit of a change there. But obviously, Trump's a very polarizing character. DeSantis is a very polarizing character. Tim Scott and Nikki Haley are a little bit more neutral when it comes to that. So we'll have to see how things play out in the next 6 to 12 months or so. Another big thing on the Democratic side is South Carolina moving into that first primary location ahead of New Hampshire, ahead of Iowa. So South Carolina can really make or break a candidate, a blue candidate rather, as a nominee. Now, again, it's very rare that you see an incumbent lose a primary, so Joe Biden is expected to continue to get that momentum there. But for the future, we'll have to see if that has any effect on future elections. And then on the Georgia side, Georgia was a red state, and then in 2020 went blue. Voted in Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. Warnock twice beat Kelly Loeffler and then beat Herschel Walker Ossoff the one time so far. We'll see what happens. I think his term comes up in 26, maybe. I don't know, something like that. So, you know, Georgia has leaned a little bit more blue over the last couple of years, and it's becoming a key swing state now when it comes to this election. Governor Brian Kemp, Donald Trump don't really get along. Kemp's not going to the RNC this year. Trump is speaking at the RNC this year for the first time since announcing, or first time back in Georgia since announcing he was running for president in 2024. So we'll have to see how that relationship impacts a possible presidential run for Donald Trump. We thought maybe one of the big things was the midterms and how Trump's relationship for good relationships or bad relationships with candidates would affect things, and it didn't seem to hurt Brian Kemp. If anything, it maybe helped Brian Kemp that he wasn't as tight with Donald Trump as he was in 2018 when he narrowly beat Stacey Abrams in that historic race then. The margin not nearly as close in 2022. So that didn't seem to hurt him. Will it hurt Trump should he get the nomination and try to win back Georgia? Who knows? We'll have to see. But that's just something that we got months and a year plus to decide all this. Obviously, we've got the more people probably going to be jumping into this race. Again, we're expecting DeSantis to jump in here in the next week or so. Mike Pence expected to join the fray. Let me check something real quick. So it looks like primaries are going to be in March, depending on the state. Let's see. There's Georgia. Georgia's March 12th, and then South Carolina, as we just said, is going to be one of the earlier ones. Well, that doesn't look right. Okay. Early next year, going to have a good idea of who the nominees are, and then things will happen there. Let me just check one more time. Okay. South Carolina will be first on February 3rd, 2024. There we go, on the Democratic side. Good. So again, South Carolina going to have a big say in the blue candidate moving forward. Probably not going to impact too much this year, just because, again, Biden's the incumbent. Bernie Sanders said he's not running. Elizabeth Warren, I don't think is going to be running. Obviously, Kamala Harris, who was in there last year, is running with Biden now. So a lot of his big opponents are not going to be in the mix this year. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, free for all. Everybody's back in there. Coming from the challenger side, they don't have the incumbent to really rally behind. Trump, obviously being such a polarizing character, going to draw some support, going to draw some naysayers. So we'll have to see who comes out of that one. But let's go ahead and play the full interviews that we have with the people that Nick talked to yesterday. So it was Robert Oldendick, a professor at South Carolina, who, when I saw him pop up, I was kind of shocked. I interviewed him back in college for a story then. And then the Republican and Democratic sides on the South Carolina side of things. So we'll play those raw interviews. It'll take about 15 minutes, and then we will come back and check in again here.
First and last name for me, and then give me your official title.
Robert Oldendick, ROBERTOLDENDICK, Professor of Political Science, University of South Carolina.
All right. And so when it kind of comes to South Carolina, the name's been out for, 2 presidential campaigns already, and then the primary. Just kind of talk about the state of, this presidential race in South Carolina.
Well, South Carolina, as you probably know, is a very Republican state. So when it comes to the general election, it's pretty well determined that the Republican candidate's going to win. What's interesting is more in the primaries. Certainly in 2016, this was the state where Donald Trump really swept. And after that, people like Jeb Bush and the remaining candidates dropped out. And then in 2020, Joe Biden really solidified, with the help of Jim Clyburn, his place for the Democratic nomination. So South Carolina plays a very important role in presidential politics, but it's more so in the primaries than in the general election.
And so with that primary being off the bat this year, how much of that kind of makes a change to it?
Well, it's always been very early now. And on the Republican side, this year it's still after Iowa and New Hampshire, but on the Democratic side, um, we're kind of first out of the box, and that would probably be more important if there wasn't an incumbent, if Joe Biden wasn't running. But right now, even though there are a couple of people that are in the race, it certainly looks like, given incumbency and the kind of name recognition and finances that he has, I don't think that while we're still, 9 months away, that there'll be much of a challenge on that side.
And just kind of looking more at Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, two from South Carolina, allies now rivals. Can you kind of talk on those two and their role in all this now?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that we've got two pretty high profile candidates, because obviously Scott being a senator and Haley being a former governor as well as ambassador to the UN. They have those qualities. They have name recognition. Certainly, they're very popular in the state. But it's a little bit surprising, I guess, that they have both entered into the Republican primary, because, as we know, both in the state and nationally, that the frontrunner Donald Trump has a very solid hold on a base. And it seems, as we talk about more people getting into the race, if we think that if Mike Pence is going to get in, and if Ron DeSantis this week, that as the number of candidates expands, it seems that the kind of function of that will be to make it kind of easier for Trump, because those solid supporters that he has, those base that he has, as the other candidates get in and kind of divide up the rest of the vote, then in those states where a plurality winner takes all the delegates, it puts him in a better position.
Awesome. And then just kind of looking at, this upcoming presidential election, compared to the past, obviously we kind of talked about South Carolina and, the strong name that, that's currently holding in with the race. But can you kind of talk on, any, major differences we might be seeing this upcoming election cycle, or, anything that might be out of the ordinary?
Well, we're projecting as to what might happen and who the front-running candidates look like at today. And what's unusual about that, if you look at kind of popularity ratings of the two frontrunners, they're both fairly negative. It's one of those things where certainly both of the front-running candidates have their supporters, but if you dig into the whole of the electorate, people aren't very enthusiastic. That it's just like, these are the rerun of 2020, and we know how the kind of the negatives that went around in that campaign. And so if the negatives continue to increase, it seems like an avenue, a possibility for a potential spoiler, a third-party candidate. Problem is that it's very hard to identify who that might be. Somebody that has to have a lot of money, a lot of name recognition, some political capital. But certainly, if you look at the broad outlines of what the 2024 presidential general election looks like, it's going to be different than past elections. It's going to be more difficult to predict, and there's going to be the possibility of something very unusual happening, given the current front-running candidates.
All right. And then just kind of an overview kind of question of, looking at, South Carolina. Is there anything unusual, just kind of in broad terms, about, this year, kind of looking at, the state as a specific with this race compared to years in the past?
No, there is nothing unusual that's going on in South Carolina at this point in time. I think that if you look at both 2020 and 2022, the elections at the state level, the Republicans have been dominant, continue to be dominant. And this past legislative session, there's an abortion issue and some things, but not really anything that's shaken thing up in terms of statewide. So at the state level, I don't see anything unusual, even though, as we've talked about, even though we have kind of two in-state candidates running for the presidential nomination, the front runner in that race has got even a dominant position, even given their popularity.
All right. Anything else you want to add that I didn't ask you about?
I think, as usual, it's just going to politics in South Carolina is always interesting. So we'll look forward to what happens.
Spelling your first and last name for me.
Andrew, Andrew Siders. S as in Sam, Ider, S as in Sam.
All right, awesome. And then can I get your official title?
Vice Chairman, Aiken County Council.
Awesome. And when it comes to, South Carolina nowadays, like, you don't really think of them being the focal point of, a presidential race, but now it's kind of shaping up that way. Can you kind of talk on, what you're seeing in your role with kind of everything going on right now?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that we have two declared candidates for president coming from our state. It's not very typical coming from a state, but that seems to be where we're at, and it's going to be a very interesting ride.
And just looking at it too, primary, South Carolina being the first primary, when it comes to pretty much a year from now, all eyes are going to be on South Carolina from the start of the race, and it seems like the entire way through with the candidates. Can you kind of talk on, just all the different pieces kind of coming together for this?
Well, the fact that they are from the state, of course, they're going to be canvassing all the areas. They're going to do a lot of politicking, probably more than just about anybody else can, because of the very nature that they're here already. So we're probably going to see a lot of activity. We're going to see a lot of stumping, and a lot of people are going to have decisions to make.
And with that primary being the first one off the bat, what are you kind of looking forward to? What are you kind of seeing on that end?
South Carolina's always set the tone for elections, and I don't see anything different with this one. I think South Carolina will be a leader like we've always been.
All right, awesome. And just kind of when it comes to, political race in general, always, presidential races are always crazy, but now when you get all this different, factors kind of in our backyard away, how interesting / like perspective does that make it seem for you?
Well, the former president made a big impact on this state. And of course, our governor was an early endorser of the president. And of course, he won at that time. And the former president's always supported the governor. So it's going to, where the relationships and who makes allies and everything else is going to play a lot into this, but it's going to be hard to beat former President Trump in the state, I would imagine.
First off, to start out, I'm just going to have you start by saying and spelling your first and last name for me.
My name is Ann Willbrand, ANNWILLBRAND.
Awesome. And can you give me your official title with?
I'm the second vice chair of the Aiken County Democratic Party.
Awesome. And then, looking at 2024, it's very, very early on, like we just kind of talked about. Just kind of talk on the sense of what the Democratic Party of Aiken has been kind of doing for that, if they have been doing anything. Just kind of what's the general state of everything right now for y'all?
Well, right now we're working at the precinct level in several precincts just to raise awareness about the party. For example, we helped Geneva Jackson with her election win in the New Elton City Council a few months ago. And so that's really where our efforts will be throughout the summer and into the fall, is precinct organizing and getting out the vote, getting voters informed about the issues.
And kind of looking at 2024, first primary is in South Carolina for the first time. All eyes are going to be on South Carolina right off the bat. Just kind of talk on that being a party leader in South Carolina for that.
Well, I think it's very exciting. I think the officials in Columbia will say the same thing, that this is going to be kind of a dry run because we're certainly behind President Biden and don't expect any strong opposition to him. But it'll be the 2028 election that is really where we'll be putting our effort when that time comes. And I think it's great that South Carolina is now the first in the nation, because the South Carolina Democratic Party electorate is much more representative of the Democratic Party as a whole than Iowa or New Hampshire have ever been. And the same is true, I guess, with Nevada, that has a large Hispanic population, we have a large African American population, and so we really are much more representative of the Democratic Party. And so I think it's a very good move for South Carolina to be first in the nation.
Yeah, and when you kind of heard that it was going to be first, what was your initial thoughts with it, like you just described there?
I don't know that I had a particular reaction, because I had been talking about it for quite a while. And it required going to the DNC. And of course, with Jamie Harrison, our former chair, state chair, as the DNC chair, and of course with the influence of Representative Jim Clyburn, once they started talking about it, it didn't seem surprising at all.
Okay, awesome. And then, is anything that the Democratic Party of Aiken's doing? It's kind of getting ready for everything. It's still early on.
Well, what I've said a minute ago, trying to raise awareness and work at the precinct level. We've got several groups around the county. We have 86 precincts now. And we have several groups. One is over in North Augusta that are working at trying to get out the vote over there. As I mentioned a minute ago, we've helped with a New Ellington race recently. And so that's going to be really our emphasis. Unfortunately, primary turnouts, no matter how important they may be, is usually fairly low, about 15%.
Okay. And how long have you kind of been with Aiken?
I've been with the party quite a while. I started as a voter protection chair in 2008 with the first Obama election. And I continue to do that. I organize and recruit and train the poll watchers for the party. But then I became an officer in, I believe it was 2010.
Okay.
And I've been reelected since then.
Awesome. All right, is there anything else you want to add that I didn't ask you about?
I don't think so right now. I mean, it is awfully early, and anything could happen. But I think overall, even though the polls are kind of iffy on this, I think people who are actually involved in the Democratic Party overall are very pleased with President Biden's successes so far. I mean, he's passed a number of important bills that are helping ordinary people, and that's what the Democratic Party is really all about.
So there you go, Nick Veland with the full interviews there from his story yesterday, talking about the shifting politics in South Carolina. What it looks like now that we've got two South Carolinians in the Republican presidential race, and South Carolina is now the first state in the Democratic primary. So there's a whole lot going on there in South Carolina. And as we know, as we talked about, Georgia has an increasing role, as well as now this major swing state that flipped from red to blue in 2020 and could flip back to red. We saw Kemp dominate in the primaries this time around in 2022, but we saw Raphael Warnock hold his seat in the Senate over Herschel Walker. So who really knows which way Georgia's going right now? So the two state playing a real interesting role in the 2024 election. But we talked about, or we heard from one of the stories that we just ran, how Trump still has a commanding lead on the Republican nomination. And let's take a look here. This is Real Clear Politics. Love this website. Check it out if you're not politically brushed up like me. And it's great here. So all the polls, Trump is up by an average of about 37 points over DeSantis. So he has more than half of the Republican people who are expected to vote in this primary, whereas DeSantis is actually losing favor. So this was, let's back up, the date should be at the bottom. Yeah, so about 2 months ago, DeSantis was only down about 15, 16 points, and that gap has now widened to about 37. So Trump's lead increasing even as these legal troubles continue to mount. That's actually built his momentum up even a little bit more. So it doesn't seem to be deterring him too much, but you have to imagine, should he win the nomination, that's something that Biden will attack pretty heavily in the debate and just in the campaign in general are those legal troubles that Donald Trump has been facing over the last 4, 5, 6 years, whatever it may be. Wanted to get into Tim Scott a little bit more too, because in watching his campaign launch yesterday, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, by the way, WRDW News 12, check it out over there. But there were some things that I thought were interesting when watching that. One of those was he never mentioned Donald Trump. He never mentioned Ron DeSantis. He never mentioned any of his political adversaries in this GOP nomination. He just talked about himself, and he talked about what he called the radical left and the Biden administration. So he talked about the economy and how that needs to be strengthened. He talked about the borders and how those need to be tightened. And he talked about the American dream and how he says he's a perfect representation of the American dream. You heard in the story that we ran from our State House reporter, Mary Green, she said he is, in his words, he is the candidate that the left fears the most. That's what I'm trying to say. He is the candidate that the left fears the most. And he says that's because he thinks that his life and his upbringing and everything he's done kind of counteracts some of the so-called narratives that the Biden administration is trying to push. So that was kind of what he had talked about. But I did think it was interesting that he never brought up any of his political adversaries, which kind of goes back to what AU professor Dr. Murray was telling me, that he's not as much of an attacker, as much of a big, bold, brash guy that's going to just stand toe-to-toe with Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis and go, shot for shot with them on the political sphere. So we'll see how that works out for him. But just found that a little interesting. Talked a lot about his upbringing and how he had a single mother growing up who used to work 16-hour jobs, and his father wasn't around, and he was failing in school, failed English class and failed Spanish class. And we heard that from his nephew as well, which I think his name was Ben. I think his name was little Ben Scott. I think that's right. Anyway, so we heard that and how he persevered and went on to become a U.S. Senator. He's got a pretty extensive political career going back to 1995 when he was 29 years old. He was in Charleston County Council for about 14 years. He did that before going to the South Carolina State House, and then to the U.S. House, and then to the U.S. Senate. So he's been on the national scale now for about 12 years. 2011 is when he took over there, but he's been in the political sphere for almost 30 years at this point, and he's only, 57? Yeah, 57 years old. Huh. Only a month older than my dad. Pretty cool. Anyway, so he's got a long political career, and most of it spent on a high level there in the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House of Representatives. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. But of course, we have all of this up on the website, WRDW.com, also on our YouTube channel, which I know I keep pushing, but that is a new thing we're trying to do, and it's pretty cool. You got a lot of good stuff up there. You want to check that out. And then the streaming app as well, WRDW streaming app. You can find that on your phone, your iPad, favorite streaming device, whatever that may be, Roku, Fire Stick, Apple TV. We're on all of those. WRDW on there. It is free to download, and it'll get you all of our first alert forecasts, I-team investigations, live newscasts, previous newscasts, Ariel Augusta. We have all sorts of stuff up there. These News 12 Now segments as well. So just download that, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You will be up to date on everything going on within our community and beyond. So we'll go ahead and start wrapping this up here. We've got midday coming up in about 15 minutes. Zaina and Tim will have the latest for you over there. As for me, I'll be back here tomorrow for Wednesday's top headlines, so I will see you back here then.